October 14th, 1943, 25,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Major Robert Johnson watches his fuel gauge needle drop below the quarter tank mark and knows with mathematical certainty that he's about to abandon 60 B-17 flying fortresses to their fate. His P-47 Thunderbolt, the most powerful fighter in the American arsenal, has reached the absolute limit of its combat radius. 375 miles from its English base, it possesses exactly enough fuel to return home, not one drop more. Below him, the bomber stream presses deeper into German airspace, toward ball-bearing factories that American strategists insist are vital to the Nazi war machine. Above and around those fortresses, Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s circle like wolves, waiting for the moment when American fighter protection disappears. That moment has arrived. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Johnson keys his radio transmitter with hands that have flown 62 combat missions and learned to recognize the bitter taste of tactical defeat. Big friend from little friend. We're at Bingo Fuel. Returning to base. The bomber formation commander's response crackles through Johnson's headset with resignation that borders on acceptance. Roger, little friend. Thanks for the ride. See you back home. What neither pilot mentions, what every airman in the 8th Air Force understands with absolute clarity, is that roughly 200 German fighters are waiting for precisely this moment. The instant when American escort fighters turn for home and leave their bombers exposed for the 300-mile gauntlet back to England. History would record that 60 B-17 seconds departed for Schweinfurt that morning. Only 33 returned. The question that haunted American air commanders through the autumn of 1943 was brutally simple. How do you win a war when your bombers can't survive the journey to their targets? The answer existed, already flying combat missions over Europe, but almost nobody believed it could work. The aircraft that would revolutionize strategic bombing had been dismissed by the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots as inferior to German fighters in every meaningful category. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong expert opinion could be. The telegram arrived at Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, on April 24, 1942, bearing news that would reshape American fighter development for the remainder of the war. The Royal Air Force had conducted combat trials of North American aviation's new fighter, designated the Mustang Mark I by British nomenclature, and their verdict was damning in its precision. Below 15,000 feet, the aircraft demonstrated excellent performance characteristics. Above 15,000 feet, where modern air combat actually occurred, it was comprehensively outmatched by every German fighter in operational service. The Allison V-1710 engine that powered the Mustang simply could not generate sufficient power at altitude, where thin air starved its single-stage supercharger. Major Thomas Hitchcock, the American air attaché in London who would later champion the Mustang's transformation, read combat reports that painted a consistent picture of an aircraft trapped between tactical requirements and engineering limitations. RAF squadron leader Ian Gleed, commanding 613 Squadron equipped with Mustang Mark Is, summarized the problem with brutal honesty in his after-action report from a sweep over northern France. The aircraft handles beautifully at low level. We can outrun anything the Germans have below 10,000 feet. But the moment we're forced to climb to intercept altitude, we're flying coffins. The Messerschmitts climb above us and bounce at will. We can't pursue them. We can't escape them. We can only hope they make mistakes. Across the Atlantic, Lieutenant General Henry Arnold, commanding the United States Army Air Forces, faced a strategic crisis that threatened the entire concept of daylight strategic bombing. American doctrine insisted that heavily armed bomber formations could fight their way to targets deep in German territory, destroy vital industrial facilities, and return home without fighter escort. This theory had been developed in peacetime by officers who had never faced coordinated attacks by experienced Luftwaffe pilots flying aircraft specifically designed to destroy bombers. Reality was systematically demolishing American assumptions. On August 17, 1942, the 8th Air Force launched its first raid against targets in occupied Europe. 12 B-17 seconds attacked the marshalling yards at Rouen, France, just 60 miles from the English coast. They returned safely, protected by RAF Spitfire escorts that could barely reach the target area and had no fuel margin for extended combat. American planners celebrated this initial success as validation of their doctrine. But, privately, thoughtful officers recognized that Rouen was essentially a coastal target, easily reached by short-range fighters. The factories, oil refineries, and ball-bearing plants that American strategists needed to destroy lay hundreds of miles deeper into Germany, far beyond the range where any existing fighter could provide protection. The mathematics of combat radius dominated every planning session at 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe, England. A P-47 Thunderbolt, the most advanced American fighter in Europe, could escort bombers to a radius of approximately 375 miles from its English base. P-38 Lightnings possessed slightly better range, perhaps 425 miles under optimal conditions. But the crucial targets that American doctrine insisted must be destroyed. Berlin, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Augsburg lay between 450 and 600 miles from England. This left a gap, what bomber crews grimly called the death zone, where American heavy bombers would fly without fighter protection for hundreds of miles through airspace defended by the most capable fighter force in the world. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the 305th Bomb Group at Chelveston, understood with absolute clarity what this gap meant for his crews. "The Germans aren't stupid," he told his squadron commanders during a planning conference in July 1943. "They know exactly where our escorts turn back. They mass their fighters just beyond that point and wait for us." The arrival of a formation of unescorted B-17 seconds at altitude over Germany was, from the Luftwaffe perspective, target practice. A single bomber carried 10 50 caliber machine guns and could generate impressive defensive firepower. But those guns could only cover specific arcs around the aircraft. German pilots had learned through bitter experience exactly which approach angles minimized their exposure to American defensive fire while maximizing their own cannon effectiveness. Major Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful bomber-destroyers, had perfected the head-on attack that exploited the B-17's weakest defensive zone. Approaching from 12 o'clock high at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, German fighters could fire their 20mm cannons and 30mm cannons for perhaps 2 seconds before breaking away. Those 2 seconds, with 4 or 6 cannons concentrating their fire on the bomber's cockpit and engines, were usually sufficient to kill the pilot and co-pilot or destroy enough of the aircraft's control systems to make continued flight impossible. American bomber crews reported these attacks with language that revealed their helplessness. "You see them coming," a 19-year-old waist gunner explained during his debriefing after the August 17th raid on Regensburg. "Little black dots at 12 o'clock, maybe 5 miles away. Then they're suddenly right there. Maybe 200 yards, and their whole nose lights up with cannon fire. You don't have time to aim, you just hold down the trigger and hope." The statistical reality was even grimmer than individual combat reports suggested. Through the summer and autumn of 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers faster than American factories could replace them. On August 17th, during simultaneous raids against Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the 8th Air Force dispatched 376 bombers. 60 were shot down, 127 were damaged, and over 600 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. This represented a loss rate of 16% per mission. Elementary mathematics proved that no military organization could sustain such casualties. At 16% loss per mission, a bomber crew faced statistical annihilation within 6 or 7 sorties. Yet, American doctrine required crews to complete 25 missions before rotation home. The numbers didn't work, the strategy didn't work, and absent some fundamental change in capability, the entire concept of daylight strategic bombing was failing. General Arnold received casualty reports at his Pentagon office and recognized that political support for the bombing campaign was eroding rapidly. The American public had accepted high casualties during the ground campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, but watching bomber crews disappear over Germany with no apparent strategic effect was generating questions from Congress and from the press, and from families who received telegram after telegram reporting sons missing in action. The solution existed in engineering rather than strategy. Somewhere in American aircraft factories, there had to be a fighter capable of escorting bombers to Berlin and back. The range requirement was absolute: 650 miles to Berlin, 650 miles return, plus fuel for combat operations over the target. 1,300 miles minimum, preferably 1,650 miles, to provide margins for weather, navigation errors, and extended combat. No fighter in American service or in development could approach this requirement. The P-47 Thunderbolt, magnificent in combat but short on range, fell 800 miles short. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines and efficient high-altitude performance, still couldn't reach beyond 450 miles. The Navy's F-4U Corsair, designed for carrier operations, possessed neither the range nor the high-altitude capability that European combat required. American aircraft designers insisted that the requirements were contradictory. A fighter needed to be light and agile to survive combat, but long range required massive internal fuel capacity that added weight and degraded maneuvering performance. You could have range or you could have combat effectiveness, but engineering reality suggested you couldn't have both. Except that Major Thomas Hitchcock, sitting in his London office reviewing RAF combat reports, had noticed something that American designers had dismissed. The North American Mustang, rejected for high-altitude operations, demonstrated a combination of characteristics that no other fighter possessed. Its laminar flow-wing design generated extraordinarily low drag at cruise speeds. Its internal fuel capacity was generous, 269 gallons in standard configuration, and most significantly, its Allison engine, though inadequate at altitude, consumed fuel with remarkable efficiency during long-range cruise flight. Hitchcock understood aircraft performance with the precision of a pilot who had flown fighters since World War I. The Mustang's problem wasn't fundamental. It was specific. Replace that inadequate Allison engine with something capable of high-altitude performance, and you might have an aircraft that could escort bombers to Berlin and fight effectively when it got there. The engine that could transform the Mustang already existed, manufactured under license in American factories. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that powered RAF Spitfires to victory during the Battle of Britain, featured a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained power output to altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet. Packard Motor Car Company was producing these engines at its Detroit plant for installation in American-built versions of British designs. Hitchcock drafted a memorandum to General Arnold that bypassed normal channels and risked career consequences if his recommendation proved wrong. The proposal was technically straightforward. Install a Packard Merlin engine in a North American Mustang airframe and test whether the resulting aircraft could meet the range requirements that bomber protection demanded. The response from Wright Field's engineering division was skeptical, bordering on dismissive. North American Aviation had designed the Mustang around the Allison engine's specific dimensions and performance characteristics. Changing power plants would require fundamental airframe modifications that might compromise the very characteristics that made the aircraft interesting. The Merlin was heavier than the Allison, potentially degrading the Mustang's excellent handling. The two-stage supercharger required modified cooling systems that could add weight and drag, but Hitchcock's memo reached General Arnold's desk at a moment when conventional solutions had demonstrably failed. Bomber losses were unsustainable. Fighter development programs offered no alternatives. Political pressure was mounting, and a proposal that combined existing components into new configurations at least offered the possibility of rapid implementation without waiting for entirely new designs. Arnold issued orders that bypassed the procurement bureaucracy and cut through the technical objections. North American Aviation would receive priority authorization to install Packard Merlin engines in 4 Mustang airframes for urgent testing. Wright Field would provide technical support, and the project would receive the highest possible priority, reflecting its potential to resolve the strategic crisis that threatened the entire bombing campaign. The engineering work began in October 1942 at North American's Inglewood, California facility. Lead engineer Edgar Schmude, the German-born designer who had created the Mustang's revolutionary airframe, approached the engine swap with methodical precision that recognized how easily the project could fail. The Packard Merlin 61 engine weighed 400 pounds more than the Allison it replaced. This weight, concentrated in the aircraft's nose, would shift the center of gravity forward and potentially make the Mustang dangerously nose-heavy. Schmude compensated by relocating the radiator and oil cooler assemblies further aft, using their weight to maintain proper balance. The Merlin's 2-stage supercharger required substantially more cooling capacity than the Allison's single-stage system. Schmude redesigned the belly-mounted radiator intake to provide increased airflow, while actually reducing drag through improved aerodynamic shaping. The propeller required complete redesign to absorb the Merlin's increased power output. Schmude specified a Hamilton standard 4-blade constant-speed propeller with 11 feet 2-inch diameter, replacing the Allison version's 3-blade design. This propeller would prove critical to the Mustang's high-altitude performance, efficiently converting engine power into thrust even in the thin air above 30,000 feet. The first Merlin-powered Mustang, designated XP-51B, completed its initial ground tests on November 30, 1942. Test pilot Robert Chilton conducted taxi trials that confirmed the aircraft's modified systems functioned correctly. Engine temperatures remained within limits. The propeller pitch control responded properly. Fuel system. Modifications delivered consistent flow to the engine's twin carburetors. On December 5th, Chilton lifted the XP-51B from Inglewood's runway and discovered an aircraft that bore little resemblance to the Allison-powered Mustang he had flown hundreds of hours. The Merlin engine developed 1,270 horsepower at 21,000 feet, compared to the Allison's peak of 1,150 horsepower at 12,000 feet. This power advantage translated into performance improvements that exceeded every prediction. Rate of climb at sea level doubled from 2,400 feet per minute to 4,800 feet per minute. Time to 20,000 feet dropped from 11.5 minutes to 6.3 minutes. Most dramatically, maximum speed at altitude increased from 390 miles per hour at 15,000 feet to 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. The XP-51B was, by substantial margin, the fastest operational fighter aircraft in the world at combat altitudes. But speed and climb rate, while impressive, weren't the characteristics that would determine whether the Mustang could escort bombers to Berlin. Range was the absolute requirement, and range depended on fuel capacity and consumption efficiency that test flights would need to verify under realistic operational conditions. Chilton conducted extended endurance trials that simulated a bomber escort mission profile. Takeoff at maximum weight, climb to 25,000 feet, cruise at combat speeds with sufficient reserves for 30 minutes of full-throttle combat, then return cruise to base with adequate fuel margins for weather contingencies and landing attempts. The results validated everything Hitchcock had theorized. With internal fuel only, 269 gallons distributed between fuselage and wing tanks, the Merlin Mustang could fly approximately 750 miles to a target, engage in combat, and return safely to base. This already exceeded the P-47's radius by 300 miles. But the XP-51B's wing design included provisions for external fuel tanks that the Allison version had rarely needed. When Schmude's engineers added 2 108-gallon drop tanks under the wings, the combat radius extended to an almost unbelievable 1,000 miles. Add fuselage fuel capacity through an 85-gallon tank behind the pilot, and the range stretched to 1,300 miles. The numbers seemed impossible. No single-engine fighter had ever demonstrated such endurance while maintaining combat performance comparable to or exceeding shorter-ranged interceptors. Yet the test data was indisputable. The Mustang, dismissed by Luftwaffe pilots as inadequate for modern combat, could now fly from England to Berlin and back with fuel reserves sufficient for extended air combat over the target. General Arnold received the P-51B test results in January 1943 and immediately ordered maximum production priority. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. North American Aviation would produce Merlin Mustangs at its Inglewood plant, while simultaneously establishing a second production line at its Dallas facility. Packard would accelerate Merlin engine production to support Mustang manufacturing plus British requirements. Every available P-51B would deploy to England for operational evaluation with the 8th Air Force. The first production Merlin Mustangs arrived at RAF Bovingdon in November 1943 for assignment to the 354th Fighter Group. Their pilots, transitioning from P-47 Thunderbolts, approached the sleek new fighters with skepticism that bordered on hostility. The Thunderbolt was a pilot's aircraft, rugged, powerful, capable of absorbing tremendous battle damage and bringing its pilot home. The Mustang looked fragile by comparison, with its narrow fuselage and delicate wing. Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Martin, who would command the 354th through its transition to Mustangs, voiced concerns that echoed through every briefing room. "This thing looks like it'll fall apart in a dive," he told his squadron commanders. "And where the hell are we supposed to fit 8 hours of fuel?" The answer to Martin's second question became apparent during their first orientation flight. The Mustang's fuselage tank, located directly behind the pilot's seat, held 85 gallons of fuel that shifted the aircraft's center of gravity dangerously far aft when full. This created handling characteristics that killed unwary pilots during takeoff or landing. The aircraft became tail-heavy and unstable, prone to snap rolls that could be fatal at low altitude. North American's technical representatives provided explicit guidance. Take off and climb to altitude with the fuselage tank full, but don't engage in combat until that fuel was consumed. Use the rear tank fuel first during cruise climb. By the time the formation reached German airspace, that 85 gallons would be gone, the center of gravity would return to normal, and the Mustang would handle with the crisp responsiveness that made it deadly in combat. The operational transformation of the 8th Air Force's fighter groups proceeded throughout December 1943 and January 1944. The 354th Fighter Group transitioned to Mustangs at Bovingdon. The 357th Fighter Group received P-51Bs at their base in Leiston. By February, the 361st Fighter Group was flying Mustangs from Bottisham. Each group's pilots discovered an aircraft that demanded different techniques than the Thunderbolts and Lightnings they had flown previously. The Mustang was light on the controls, responsive to pilot inputs with immediacy that could be disconcerting after flying the ponderous P-47. It accelerated and decelerated more rapidly, requiring constant attention to airspeed during formation flying, and its laminar flow wing, while extraordinarily efficient at cruise speeds, could stall suddenly and without warning if the pilot mismanaged his energy during combat maneuvering. But the pilots also discovered capabilities that no other fighter possessed. The Mustang could sustain cruise speeds of 320 miles per hour at 25,000 feet for hours, maintaining formation with B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds without the constant throttle adjustments that characterized P-47 escort work. It could dive on German fighters from altitude and accelerate through 450 miles per hour, without suffering the compressibility problems that made high-speed dives in other fighters dangerous. Most significantly, it could fight effectively at altitudes where German fighters struggled. At 30,000 feet, where the air was so thin that pilots breathed pure oxygen through masks that froze to their faces, the Merlin engine's two-stage supercharger maintained power output that gave Mustang pilots decisive advantages over Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs, whose engines gasped for air. The test that would prove or disprove the Mustang's capability came on March 4th, 1944. The 8th Air Force planned a maximum effort against Berlin, Germany's capital, and the symbolic heart of Nazi power. 672 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds would attack industrial targets across the city in a raid designed to demonstrate American reach and German vulnerability. Fighter escort would accompany the bombers across the entire route, from English bases to Berlin and back. This represented a fundamental shift in strategic bombing doctrine. No longer would American bombers fight their way through hundreds of miles of undefended airspace. Instead, Mustangs would provide continuous protection, engaging German fighters whenever and wherever they appeared. For the Mustang pilots of the 354th, 357th, and 361st Fighter Groups, this mission would answer the question that had haunted American air strategy for 18 months. Could single-engine fighters escort heavy bombers 1,300 miles into Germany and return home? The doubters insisted it was impossible. The Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots had publicly dismissed the entire concept as American fantasy. History would record their verdict within the next 8 hours. March 4th, 1944, 0430 hours, RAF Boxted, England. Captain Donald Blakesley stands in the pre-dawn darkness, watching ground crews fuel his P-51B Mustang with a precision that borders on ritual. 269 gallons internal fuel. 2 108-gallon drop tanks under the wings, 85 gallons in the fuselage tank behind his seat. 470 gallons total, more fuel than his aircraft weighs empty. The mathematics are unforgiving. Berlin lies 590 miles east-southeast of this English airfield. The mission profile calls for cruise, climb to 25,000 feet, rendezvous with bomber formations over the North Sea, then penetrate German airspace at combat speeds while maintaining position relative to aircraft flying 180 miles per hour. Fight for 30 minutes over the target. Return home with sufficient reserves for weather diversions and multiple landing attempts if bases are fog-bound. 1,350 miles minimum, perhaps 1,600 if conditions deteriorate. Blakesley has flown 116 combat missions in Spitfires, Thunderbolts, and now Mustangs. He understands with absolute clarity what this mission represents. Either his aircraft will perform as North Americans' engineers promised, or he'll be walking home through Germany with his crew behind him as prisoners of war. The briefing at 0500 hours reveals a raid of unprecedented scale. 672 heavy bombers will strike Berlin in 3 massive formations. The first wave targets the Erkner ball-bearing plant. The second wave hits the Daimler-Benz tank engine factory at Genshagen. The third wave attacks the industrial district of Charlottenburg, with emphasis on electrical and optical manufacturing. Fighter escort will consist of 73 P-51 Mustangs from the 4th Fighter Group at Debden, 68 Mustangs from the 354th Fighter Group at Boxted, and 59 Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group at Leiston, plus 165 P-47 Thunderbolts providing initial escort and target area support, and 78 P-38 Lightnings covering the withdrawal phase. But the Mustangs alone will fly the entire mission profile. From English bases to Berlin and back, they will remain with the bombers through every mile of hostile airspace. This represents a fundamental transformation of American air strategy, made possible by an aircraft that Luftwaffe intelligence had dismissed as tactically irrelevant. Blakesley walks to his Mustang through darkness that smells of aviation, gasoline, and cold English rain. His crew chief, Technical Sergeant John Ferrer, has prepared the aircraft with attention to detail that reflects 4 years of maintaining fighters under combat conditions. Every panel is secured. Every connection is torqued to specification. The Packard Merlin engine, pre-flighted and tested, idles with the characteristic rumble of 12 cylinders, producing 1,300 horsepower. The takeoff roll is longer than Blakesley has experienced in any previous fighter. 470 gallons of fuel plus 650 caliber machine guns with 1,600 rounds of ammunition creates a gross weight that makes the Mustang feel sluggish during the initial acceleration. He rotates at 120 miles per hour, considerably faster than normal, and climbs away from Boxted with the nose high and airspeed building slowly through the dense morning air. Around him, 67 other Mustangs are, executing identical departures, forming into squadron elements that will consolidate into group formations over the North Sea. The assembly requires 30 minutes of careful flying as pilots maintain position using only wing lights in the pre-dawn darkness. Navigation to the rendezvous point demands precise dead reckoning across water, where a 5-degree heading error could place them 50 miles off course. At 06:15 hours, with dawn breaking across the eastern horizon, Blakesley's formation intercepts the bomber stream at 16,000 feet over the Dutch coast. The sight confirms everything the briefing described and simultaneously makes the mission's magnitude viscerally apparent. 672 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds stretching across 40 miles of sky, their contrails marking their position for every German radar operator and fighter controller between Holland and Berlin. The first German fighters appear at 06:47 hours as the formation crosses into Doof, German airspace near Osnabrück, Messerschmitt 109Gs from Jagdgeschwader 3, climbing from bases around Munster with the tactical advantage of interior position and early warning from radar controllers who have tracked the American formation since it departed England. Blakesley identifies them as small black dots at 2 o'clock high, approximately 8 miles distant and climbing to position themselves for diving attacks on the bomber formations. He keys his radio transmitter with the discipline of a pilot who has learned that excess communication degrades rather than enhances tactical effectiveness. Bandits, 2 o'clock high, Angels 2 to 8, engage. The 4th Fighter Group's top cover squadron, 16 Mustangs led by Major James Goodson, separates from the escort formation and climbs to intercept the German fighters before they can achieve attack position. This is the tactical revolution that the Mustang has enabled. Previously, American escort fighters operated at Fingsar Salama, 7 marks in place T-14, CAPAC, a maximum range and couldn't afford the fuel expenditure that combat maneuvering required. They watched helplessly as German fighters positioned themselves optimally, then attacked bombers with minimal interference. Now, with fuel reserves sufficient for extended combat, Mustang pilots can engage German fighters aggressively, disrupting their attack formations and forcing them into defensive maneuvering that consumes fuel and prevents coordinated bomber attacks. The mathematics of aerial combat have shifted decisively in favor of the defenders. Goodson's squadron intercepts the Messerschmitts at 28,000 feet, converting their altitude advantage into the energy that determines victory or defeat in aerial combat. The Germans recognize immediately that these American fighters are not the Thunderbolts they've grown accustomed to engaging. The Mustangs climb with authority that matches or exceeds the Messerschmitt's capabilities. They accelerate rapidly in the thin air, where German fighters normally hold decisive advantages. Lieutenant Urban Drew, flying as Goodson's wingman, describes the engagement in his combat report with precision that captured the transformation. "We caught them climbing through 26,000. I selected the number 3 aircraft in their formation and closed from his 7 o'clock high. The Mustang accelerated smoothly to 420 miles per hour. At 300 yards, I opened fire with a 2-second burst that walked 50 caliber rounds from his left wing route through the cockpit. The aircraft rolled inverted and entered a vertical dive trailing smoke and debris. Drew's victory, the first Mustang kill over Germany, occurs at 06:52 hours, just 5 minutes after the initial intercept. But more significantly, the aggressive engagement has disrupted the entire German attack formation. The Messerschmitts, instead of positioning for coordinated bomber attacks, find themselves defending against American fighters that can match them in every regime of flight. The bomber stream continues eastward, unmolested, while German fighters attempt to reorganize for renewed attacks. This pattern, attack disruption rather than defensive protection, will characterize the entire mission and redefine the tactical relationship between fighters and bombers. At 0720 hours, with the formation approaching Hanover, a second wave of German fighters appears. Focke-Wulf 190A8s from Jagdgeschwader 1, perhaps 40 aircraft climbing from bases around Brunswick. Their radial engine fighters are optimized for attacking bombers, heavily armed with 4 20mm cannons and 2 30mm cannons, but less maneuverable than the lighter Messerschmitts. Major Dwayne Beeson, leading the 334th Fighter Squadron, engages this formation with tactics that would be impossible in shorter-ranged fighters. Instead of remaining tied to the bomber formation and reacting to German attacks, he takes his squadron 5 miles ahead of the bombers and establishes a barrier patrol that German fighters must penetrate to reach their targets. The Focke-Wulfs attempt to dive through Beeson's squadron, using their superior dive speed to achieve separation and approach the bombers from below. But the Mustang's exceptional dive characteristics allow Beeson's pilots to follow them through accelerations that would make other fighters dangerous to control. At speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour, where compressibility makes control surfaces heavy and unresponsive in most aircraft, the Mustang remains stable and responsive. Lieutenant Ralph Hofer, flying his 37th mission, pursues a Focke-Wulf through a dive that begins at 28,000 feet and continues to 12,000 feet before the German pilot attempts recovery. The Mustang closes relentlessly, its laminar flow wing generating less drag than the Focke-Wulf's conventional airfoil. At 200 yards, Hofer fires a sustained burst that penetrates the German fighter's engine cowling and ignites its fuel system. The Focke-Wulf explodes with violence that sends debris fragments past Hofer's canopy. By 0800 hours, the formation has penetrated 250 miles into Germany, deeper than any previous escort mission. The Mustang pilots monitor their fuel consumption with attention that determines whether they'll complete the mission or become statistics. Blakesley's own calculations show fuel burn slightly higher than planning assumptions predicted, the result of combat maneuvering and higher power settings required to maintain position with the bombers. But the numbers remain within acceptable margins. His internal fuel indicates 180 gallons remaining, approximately 60% of original capacity. The drop tanks are empty, jettisoned when German fighters first appeared to reduce drag and improve maneuvering performance. The 85-gallon fuselage tank, consumed during the climb and early cruise phase, no longer affects the aircraft's center of gravity. The formation crosses the Elbe River at 0820 hours, with Berlin visible on the horizon as a brown haze of industrial smoke and morning fog. German fighter activity intensifies dramatically as Luftwaffe controllers commit their reserve forces to defending the capital. Jagdgeschwader 11 from airfields around Berlin launches every available aircraft. Jagdgeschwader 26 sends its fighters from fields north of the city. Jagdgeschwader 54 scrambles from bases to the south. Over 100 German fighters converge on the American formation in a coordinated defense that represents the Luftwaffe's maximum effort. Their controllers have learned through bitter experience that attacking American bomber formations requires overwhelming numbers applied simultaneously to saturate defensive firepower and penetrate fighter escorts. Today's attack involves aircraft from across northern Germany, vectored by ground radar to intercept points where the bomber stream must pass. But the Mustang pilots, with sufficient fuel reserves to engage in extended combat, disrupt this coordination systematically. Each German formation, attempting to position for bomber attacks, encounters aggressive fighter sweeps that force defensive maneuvering. The Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs cannot ignore American fighters diving on them from altitude because ignoring such attacks means death. Yet engaging those fighters means abandoning their primary mission of destroying bombers. Major Gerald Johnson, leading the 357th Fighter Group's penetration support, identifies the tactical transformation in his post-mission report. The Germans were completely frustrated. Every time they attempted to form up for coordinated attacks on the bombers, we'd hit them. They couldn't ignore us because we had altitude and energy. Advantage. They couldn't fight us effectively because they were configured for bomber interception, not fighter combat. And they couldn't disengage because we had the fuel to pursue them. The bomber formations reach Berlin at 08:45 hours and begin their attack runs through flak that fills the sky with black explosions and metal fragments. The Mustang escorts remain with them, maintaining formation positions 5,000 feet above the bomber stream, where they can observe approaching threats and dive to intercept. German fighters make repeated attempts to penetrate the escort screen. A formation of 12 Messerschmitt 109Gs approaches from 3 o'clock high, diving toward the B-17 seconds with closing speeds that give them perhaps 10 seconds to fire before breaking away. Blakesley intercepts them at the beginning of their attack run, forcing the formation leader into evasive maneuvering that ruins his firing solution. The other German pilots, maintaining formation discipline, follow their leader through the break and never fire their weapons. This pattern repeats across the target area. German fighters attempting to attack bombers find themselves constantly harassed by Mustang escorts that possess sufficient fuel reserves to maintain aggressive tactics. The result is dramatically reduced bombing losses compared to previous Berlin raids. Of the 672 bombers that reached the target area, only 24 failed to return, a loss rate of 3.6%, substantially lower than the 16% losses that characterized unescorted missions. The return flight tests the Mustang's endurance more severely than the penetration phase. German fighters, with bases between Berlin and the Dutch border, can land, refuel, and intercept the American formation multiple times during its withdrawal. The Luftwaffe commits fresh squadrons against bombers and escorts that have been flying combat operations for over 3 hours. At 09:30 hours, approximately 100 miles west of Berlin, Major Heinz Bahr leads 16 Messerschmitt 109Gs from Jagdgeschwader, 3 in an intercept that he believes will duplicate previous successful engagements against American fighters returning from deep penetration raids. His intelligence briefings have emphasized that American escorts typically turn back east of Hanover due to fuel limitations, leaving bombers vulnerable during the final 200 miles to safety. Bahr's squadron approaches from 6 o'clock high, the classic bounce position that gives them every tactical advantage. But instead of finding exhausted American pilots nursing fuel-starved fighters toward England, they encounter Mustang escorts that engage with the same aggressive tactics they employed over Berlin. Captain Willard Milliken, leading the 336th Fighter Squadron's rear guard element, reverses into Bahr's attack with his entire 8-ship formation. The tactical surprise is complete. Bahr has never encountered American fighters with sufficient fuel reserves to engage in offensive maneuvering this deep into Germany during return phases. His formation, configured for a single high-speed attack pass, suddenly faces sustained combat with opponents who can afford the fuel expenditure that dogfighting demands. The engagement develops into a swirling melee that ranges across 15 miles of sky and 3,000 feet of altitude. Bahr, one of Germany's most experienced fighter pilots with over 200 victories, discovers that experience and skill cannot overcome the fundamental advantage that fuel reserves provide. His Messerschmitts, operating near their maximum range from base, must disengage after 10 minutes of combat or risk fuel exhaustion that will force emergency landings in Allied-controlled territory. Milliken's Mustangs, with sufficient fuel for another hour of combat operations, press the engagement relentlessly. Lieutenant Shelton. Monroe destroys 2 Messerschmitts during separate deflection shots that demonstrate the Mustang's excellent high-speed handling characteristics. Captain Vermont Garrison flames a 3rd German fighter after pursuing it through a series of vertical maneuvers that would be impossible in fuel-limited aircraft. Bahr escapes with his remaining fighters, but his post-combat report to Jagdgeschwader 3 headquarters reveals recognition that something fundamental has changed in the aerial balance over Germany. American fighters now possess range equal to or exceeding our own defensive capabilities. They can escort bombers to any target in Germany and maintain combat effectiveness throughout the mission. This represents a decisive shift in strategic capability that current defensive tactics cannot counter. His assessment reaches Luftwaffe High Command within hours and generates responses ranging from disbelief to alarm. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, has received intelligence reports about American long-range fighter development, but dismissed them as exaggerated claims designed to boost Allied morale. The combat reports from March 4th force complete reconsideration of these assumptions. Galland orders immediate investigation of the American fighters that escorted bombers to Berlin. His intelligence staff analyzes gun camera footage, interrogates captured pilots, and reviews technical specifications provided by agents operating in England and America. The conclusion is unambiguous. The North American P-51 Mustang, previously dismissed as inadequate for modern air combat, has been fundamentally transformed through engine changes and fuel system modifications. The aircraft that Luftwaffe pilots had encountered over northern France in 1942, with its inadequate high-altitude performance and limited tactical capabilities, no longer exists. The Merlin-powered Mustang operates effectively at 30,000 feet, matches or exceeds German fighters in speed and climb rate, and possesses combat radius that makes every target in Germany vulnerable to escort coverage. Galland's report to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, dated March 8, 1944, contains language that acknowledges strategic defeat in the air war over Germany. The appearance of American long-range escort fighters over Berlin represents a fundamental change in the tactical and strategic situation. Our fighters can no longer attack American bomber formations with the expectation of achieving decisive results. The bomber crews are now protected throughout their entire mission profile by escorts that can engage our fighters on equal or superior terms. The statistical evidence supports Galland's assessment with numbers that reveal the transformation's magnitude. During January and February 1944, before Mustangs became operational in significant numbers, the 8th Air Force lost an average of 46 bombers per mission to enemy action, representing loss rates between 5 and 8%. March missions, with Mustang escorts providing coverage to target and back, saw average losses drop to 28 bombers per mission, loss rates between 3 and 4%. More significantly, German fighter losses increased dramatically. Luftwaffe day fighter units lost 231 aircraft during January and February combined. During March alone, with Mustangs engaging German fighters aggressively throughout the mission profile, Luftwaffe losses reached 356 aircraft. The attrition rate was unsustainable for German pilot training programs that could not replace experienced pilots at the rate combat operations consumed them. The human dimension of this transformation appears in letters and diaries from both sides of the conflict. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, flying his 43rd mission in a Mustang after transitioning from P-47 Thunderbolts, writes to his family in Oklahoma with language that reveals tactical confidence absent from earlier correspondence. "We're no longer fighting defensively, trying to protect bombers from attacks we can't prevent. We're taking the fight to the Germans on our terms, with aircraft that can go anywhere they can go and fight them on equal footing." From the German perspective, Lieutenant Heinz Nock, a Messerschmitt pilot with 33 victories, records in his diary the psychological impact of facing escorts that cannot be avoided or outrun. "The Americans have solved the range problem that protected us during the early bombing campaign. Now their fighters appear everywhere, over every target, with fuel and ammunition sufficient to engage us throughout the combat zone. We cannot achieve numerical superiority because they can afford to pursue individual aircraft while maintaining formation protection. The tactical situation has become untenable. The strategic implications extend beyond individual missions, or monthly statistics. General Karl Spaatz, commanding United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, recognizes that the Mustang has enabled the air campaign that American doctrine envisioned but could not previously execute. In April 1944, he issues operational directives that fundamentally restructure American air strategy in Europe. Instead of concentrating bomber raids for mutual defensive protection and accepting the losses that German fighter attacks inflicted, Sparts disperses formations across multiple targets simultaneously. Mustang escorts, with their exceptional range, it can protect bombers attacking oil refineries in Silesia, while other formations strike aircraft factories in Bavaria, and still others attack transportation targets in western Germany. The Luftwaffe, forced to defend multiple locations simultaneously, cannot mass forces effectively against any single raid. The oil campaign that begins in May 1944 demonstrates the transformation's full strategic impact. American bombers attack synthetic oil plants at Pollitz, Merseburg, Leuna, and Brooks, targets located between 400 and 650 miles from English bases. Mustang escorts provide continuous protection, engaging German fighters that attempt to defend these strategically vital facilities. German oil production, which reached its peak of 316,000 tons in March 1944, drops to 150,000 tons by September and continues declining through the autumn as repeated attacks destroy refining capacity faster than repairs can restore it. By December, German synthetic oil production has collapsed to 26,000 tons, less than 10% of peak output. The Wehrmacht's mechanized forces, the Luftwaffe's training programs, and Germany's industrial economy face fuel shortages that become increasingly catastrophic. This strategic success would be impossible without long-range fighter escorts that can protect bombers attacking the most distant and heavily defended targets. The Mustang, dismissed by German experts as tactically irrelevant, has enabled the air campaign that systematically destroys Germany's capacity to wage industrialized warfare. The technological and tactical revolution that the P-51 represents extends beyond its immediate combat applications. Aircraft designers throughout the world recognize that the Mustang's laminar flow wing and efficient aerodynamics have established new standards for fighter performance. The concept of long-range escort fighters, previously dismissed as incompatible with the agility requirements of air combat, becomes the dominant design philosophy for post-war fighter development. Soviet aircraft designers, studying captured Mustangs and technical intelligence reports, develop similar long-range fighters for their own strategic air forces. British designers incorporate laminar flow wing principles into jet fighter programs. Even the Luftwaffe, in the final months of the war, attempts to develop long-range jet fighters based on lessons learned from combat against American escorts. But these developments come too late to affect the war's outcome. By summer 1944, Allied air superiority over Western Europe is absolute. The Normandy invasion succeeds partly because Luftwaffe fighters cannot effectively challenge Allied air operations. The advance across France and into Germany proceeds under air cover that prevents German armoured counterattacks from achieving tactical surprise or operational success. The Mustang pilots who flew those early Berlin missions continue operations through the remainder of the war, accumulating victory totals that reflect their aircraft's technical superiority and their own developing tactical skills. Major George Preddy, flying with the 352nd Fighter Group, achieves 26.8 to 3 victories before his death in December 1944 from friendly ground fire. Major John Meyer, commanding the 352nd's 487th Fighter Squadron, destroys 24 German aircraft in aerial combat. Captain Don Gentile and Lieutenant John Godfrey, flying as a two-ship element with the 4th Fighter Group, combine for 58 confirmed victories. These individual achievements, while impressive, matter less than the collective impact of Mustang operations on German defensive capabilities. From March 1944 through May 1945, P-51 equipped fighter groups destroy over 5,000 German aircraft in aerial combat, while losing approximately 2,000 Mustangs to all causes. More significantly, they enable the bomber offensive that destroys German industrial capacity and reduces the Nazi war machine to ineffectiveness. The final irony emerges from captured German documents and post-war interrogations of Luftwaffe commanders. German engineers had understood the theoretical advantages of long-range fighter escorts years before American implementation. Messerschmitt had proposed designs for extended-range versions of the 109 that could have provided bomber protection comparable to what the Mustang achieved. But German doctrine, focused on short-range interceptors optimized for defending German airspace, never prioritized long-range fighter development. When the Luftwaffe recognized the strategic value of such aircraft, German industrial capacity had already been compromised by Allied bombing. The factories that could have produced long-range fighters were simultaneously tasked with manufacturing interceptors, ground attack aircraft, jet fighters, and the exotic weapons systems that Nazi leadership demanded. Resource constraints and strategic confusion prevented German designers from implementing solutions that their technical expertise made feasible. The Mustang succeeded not only because of its exceptional design and engineering, but because American industrial capacity could support specialized aircraft development while maintaining production of other essential combat types. This represented strategic depth that German forces, operating under increasing material constraints, could not match. Captain Donald Blakesley lands at Debden at 13:45 hours on March 4, 1944, after 8 hours and 15 minutes of continuous flight. His Mustang's fuel gauges indicate 75 gallons remaining, sufficient for another 45 minutes of flight under cruise conditions. The mission that experts insisted was impossible has been completed successfully, establishing beyond doubt that American fighters can escort bombers to any target in Germany. His brief comment to the crew chief who meets him on the hard stand captures the transformation with economy that combat pilots favor. It works. Tell North American their airplane does everything they promised, and more. Within weeks, that assessment spreads through every fighter group in the 8th Air Force, transforming the Mustang from an experimental long-range fighter into the dominant escort aircraft that will characterize American air operations for the remainder of the war. The aircraft that Luftwaffe pilots called Inferior had proved itself superior in the only test that mattered: combat operations against the most capable air force in the world, under conditions that demanded maximum performance and absolute reliability. The engineering achievement that made this possible, combining an American airframe with a British engine through modifications that enhanced rather than compromised both, represents one of the most significant technological successes of the Second World War. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.